What's going on, guys? Moralltach Monthly 38 has just wrapped up, so you already know what time it is. It's time to go over the event, take a look at what decks actually entered, what decks topped, look at the deck list, see if there's any cool tech cards or trends we're starting to see, and just everything you need to know about this event. Now, obviously, Moralltach Monthly is one of the larger H.A.T format online tournaments. It's free to enter, and it's held through the H.A.T Alliance Discord server, so if you're interested in playing in an event like this, as well as other online H.A.T format tournaments that are free to enter, and some even have small fees to enter, but you can win money and things like that, definitely go down to the video description and you can find a link on how to join the H.A.T Alliance Discord server. It'll take you right there, join, and when there's events, you can enter them and play in things like this. But anyways, here we have the breakdown for the decks that actually entered. There were 59 players in this tournament, so a pretty decent size, and I would say sort of an average for the Moralltach Monthlies, give or take. Some are a little higher, some are a little lower, but usually they float in that, 50 to almost 70 range at times. So yeah, it was a pretty decent size, and here is the breakdown. There were 8 Geargia, 6 artifact Traptrix, 4 Mythic Ruler, 4 Mermail, 3 Spellbook, 3 Bujin, 3 Sylvan, 3 other, not entirely sure what these are, 3 Lightsworn Ruler, 2 Badland Boxer, 2 Hieratic Ruler, 2 Cyber Dragon Artifact, 2 Hieratic Geargia, 1 Harpy, 1 Fat, 1 Firefist Traptrix, so without the artifacts, 1 Fire King, 1 Evol, 1 Artifact Spirit, 1 Gadget, 1 Frog OTK, 1 Koikimiru, 1 Artifact Ghostrick, 1 Constellar Artifact, 1 Koikimiru Firefist, 1 Madolche, and lastly, 1 Traptrix Worm. So obviously a extremely diverse meta, and while we usually do see very diverse in H.A.T format, given, again, it is one of the most diverse retro formats out there, in my opinion, it's kind of interesting to see just like how many decks are actually viable. Usually you'll see a lot more of the bigger chunks on it, so it almost kind of look like one of these graphs off to the right here, but instead we are just seeing so many people trying so many different decks. And looking at this, Geargia did have slightly more than Artifact Traptrix, which usually, again, these are usually pretty tied. So we are seeing a bit more Geargia, which might mean that maybe people are trying to, push it a little harder. But at the same time, it's not enough data really to show that, given that in the other events, it was also kind of even, while now it's pushing a little ahead. Besides that, 4 Mythic Ruler is definitely a pretty good number. Because for a while, Mythic Ruler and Hieratic Ruler had kind of died down a bit. Seeing 4 Mermail is pretty good, 3 Spellbook. It looks like, yeah, okay, there was even some Sylvan mixed in there. No Infernity, again, usually people like me to bring up Infernity, and I feel like in every one of these videos, we kind of see it sometimes, but it's really not as popular, unfortunately, for a lot of these events. It has its own list of problems, but also people just playing multiple rounds of some of these events with a deck that, takes a lot of brain power. Not that any of these other decks don't, but like just it's a combo deck. It takes a while, stuff like that. And it can be somewhat exhausting, but overall, really nice to see such a diverse spread of decks. And you guys can let me know what you think of this breakdown, but let's actually go and take a look at the decks that actually topped this event. So here we have in first place Bujin's. We had extra power. He has been on a roll lately. He's also, checked out some of these videos, and I always appreciate the people that actually play in these events, commenting and letting me know about their experience and stuff. He has been just topping everything lately. So for him to actually take down this event, it's really cool to see. Again, I've talked to him through the comment section and stuff. Really nice guy. And I would assume, given how his lists have been, this is going to be very similar to his other lists. Second place was Wizkalina, who was playing, I believe this was Cat. Third or fourth place was Hieratic Ruler. Really cool to see Hieratic Ruler actually make it this far. Hieratic Ruler had recently, I believe, topped or won Another one of the online hat format tournaments, it was a different pilot. This one is Tiger, or I believe Tiger Soldier. The other one was Big Bert. I believe he got first at the last event, playing the Hieratic Ruler deck, but obviously that's a slightly smaller event. This one is much larger, but very cool to see. We'll have to see if it matches kind of the other guy's list. After that, in, again, third or fourth, there was Mermail. It's nice to see Mermail kind of showing up again, as a lot of people were disappointed that it wasn't around too much for a while there, but it is starting to make its way back in. After that, we have Artifact Traptrix. I believe this one is H.A.T, so this is with the hands, whereas this was the card version. After that, we had Geargia. I'm pretty sure this is like the Geargia Traptrix deck. There's a lot to say about that type of list, and we'll talk about that more when we actually get into it, but pretty cool to see that. And then in 7th and 8th was Mythic Ruler. This was actually a Mythic Ruler hands deck, so slightly different from what you might expect, obviously playing the hands, and again, we'll talk more into that in a little bit. And lastly, another Artifact Traptrix deck. This one, I believe, was also a cat list. So seeing, only one Geargia actually made it into the top cut. We had one of the Mermail make it into the top cut. Bujin and, won the event. And even some of these other decks that we don't see as often, the Hieratic Ruler and even the Mythic Ruler, has slowly started popping up a bit more, but it, had kind of died down for a while. So really nice to see somewhat diverse, even the top cut for the top 8. But anyways, guys, let's take a second and go over those deck lists. All right, so first up, we do have the Bujin list, and at quick glance, I'm pretty sure this looks just like their other builds. I'll see if I notice any basic differences as we go on, so I'm probably just going to go through the card for this one instead of really breaking everything down, as I've gone over it multiple times at this point in other videos, so you should definitely check out the other hat format tournament review videos and stuff, and you'll probably find a more in-depth video or explanation for this specific person's deck list. But anyways, they played 1 copy of Harume, 2 Mikazuchi, 3 Yamato, 3 Crane, 2 copies of Hare, 1 copy of Quillen, 1 copy of Sinew, 2 copies of Turtle, and then they played the 2 copies of DD Crow and the 1 copy of Honest. For the spells, they played 3 copies of Bujin Carnation, 3 copies of Tenki, 2 copies of Chalice, and 3 copies of Lance. I do remember last time they did up the Lance to 3, but they kept the Chalice at 2. After that, the 3 Duality and the 2 copies of Upstart. This is what they did the last time as well. And they had mentioned that they had kind of needed a extra spot and they didn't really want to cut anything else. And Upstart, while it does kind of hurt the consistency in a sense, they felt that the extra copy of Lance was more important than the 3rd Upstart. So that was the same from what I'm remembering. After that, the 1 Bottomless, 1 Torrential, 1 Warning, and 3 copies of Breakthrough looks, exactly the same as last time. And I've said it before, this list looks very, very solid. In the side deck, they are still on the 1 copy of Centipede. I remember they had commented and mentioned that they were considering swapping this for a 2nd copy of Twister, but it looks like they did decide to keep it in for this event. After that, we see the 3rd Crow and 3 Maxi. Love to see that, having the extra copies to make the sets. 1 Dark Hole, 1 Mind Control, 3 MST, 1 Twister, 2 copies of DNA Surgery, and 2 copies of Debunk. It all looks great, as I mentioned before. Moving on to the extra deck, 1 Dweller, 1 Kagetsuchi, 3 Susanoo, 1 Omega, 1 Direwolf, 1 Exciton, 1 Cowboy, 1 101, 1 Ragna Zero, 1 Black Ship of Corn, 1 copy of Heartland Draco, 1 Crazy Box, and 1 Paladynamo. Overall, very solid, and like I said, they have been seeing a lot of success with this list, or at least extremely similar lists. So not a whole lot to say with that. Congrats again to this player, and let's move on to the next list. Next up, we have the 2nd place cat list, and right off the bat, there's a couple small things I'm noticing. I'll talk about it as we go through the deck list, but here they chose to play 2 copies of Beagletach, 3 copies of Moralltach, and the Scythe. So they are playing a much larger package of the artifacts. I know a lot of people like to keep it somewhere around, 4 to 5 artifacts, whether that be like 1 Beagletach and 3 Moralltach, or around the 1 Beagletach, 3 Moralltach, and the Scythe. But here we see them actually playing the whole suite of them, which we've seen it before. It just feels a little less common. Sometimes it is really nice to have the extra copy of Beagletach, which I would assume that a lot of times the Beagletach at 2 is kind of where they decide if they want that extra artifact or not. But in Cat, you can kind of afford to play the extra ones, though usually you see a ratio like this in the Curry Bandit version because you'd want to be milling them. So that is a little different. Then we see the 3-card Cardi, 2 copies of Dionea, and 3 Mermail, and that is it. So for the monsters, they're choosing to basically have more focus actually on the artifacts, as Cat usually plays hand traps because, card cars usually get you into them, but here it looks like they were definitely prioritizing the engine of the deck. So we see, no Maxies or Crows in the main deck. I see them down here. We'll talk about that. But yeah, very interesting to see that. For the spells, they played the 3 copies of Ignition and 2 Double Cyclone, very standard, 1 Dark Hole, 3 copies of Duality, and 2 copies of Soul Charge. That all looks good as well. For the traps, they played 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 Bottomless, 2 Breakthrough Skill, 3 Call the Haunted, which, seeing that they played so many artifacts, the triple Call the Haunted makes a little more sense than how a lot of the builds will only play 2 Call the Haunted, or even, sometimes even 1 Soul Charge. But since they are really trying to go through this artifact engine, it definitely makes sense. After that, we have the 1 Compulse, 1 copy of Warning, 1 copy of Torrential, 1 Wiretap, and 2 copies of Traptrix Traphole Nightmare. It felt like for a while a lot of people had cut down actually on the Traptrix Traphole Nightmare, only playing 1 copy, because I remember some of the older lists definitely did play 2 copies, so it's kind of neat to see that little trend coming back. Looking at the side deck, we see all the hand traps imaginable. We see 2 copies of Crow, 2 copies of Flying Sea, and 3 copies of Maxi. Really like to see that. Personally, I really like Flying Sea in the side, and so whenever anyone, chooses to play that, it's always great to see. The 1 copy of Mind Control in the side, 2 copies of Acid Trap Hole, and 2 copies of Deep Dark Trap Hole. That's very interesting. I guess with Geargia being so prevalent, it is nice to have that kind of extra copy in a sense to be able to really blow them out. And given that Mythic Ruler and Hieratic Ruler did top this event, I'm pretty sure that this card would be really nice to see. So it's actually kind of nice to see that this is, at 2 in their side deck. Then we obviously see the 2 copies of Debunk, which is kind of a staple side deck for a lot of people, and the extra copy of Wiretap. Looking at the extra deck, they chose to play 1 Dweller, 1 Durendal, 1 Karen Gorgon, 2 copies of Constellar Pleiades, 1 copy of Exciton, 1 Cowboy, 1 copy of Gaia Dragon, 2 101s, 1 Ragnazero, 1 Black Ship, 1 Volcasaurus, 1 Rhapsody and Berserk, and 1 copy of Tyrus. Overall, the extra deck looks really good, and the list, honestly, there was a couple of things that I said were a little interesting, but overall, not a bad list at all, and obviously getting second place out of, 59 players is a very solid, end place, so congrats to this player as well, and let's move on to the next one. Next up, we have the Hieratic Ruler list, and at quick glance, the main deck minimally looks very similar to the last list that actually ended up winning that other H.A.T format tournament. Again, I'm kind of having a brain fog on what event it was. But anyways, looking at it, let's just go through the card by card and talk about it. We see 2 copies of Flamevel Guard, 2 copies of Labradorite Dragon. We have the 4 Dragon Rulers, the Blaster, Redox, Tempest, and Tidal, the 1 copy of Corseska, and 1 copy of Debris Dragon, 3 copies of Esset, 1 copy of Nebthet, 3 copies of Su, and 2 copies of Tefnuit. That's the same ratio of Tefnuit as the last list, which is why I say it seems very similar. Also, when we get into the spells, obviously the reasoning was something that the other list played that I thought was really cool. There's a handful of reasons for that, which I talked about before. It's basically that, like, even if you don't hit, like, if your opponent calls the right level off of the reasoning, it's at bare minimum basically a foolish burial, which, dragons play out of the graveyard, so you don't really care. And if you happen to actually get a monster, then you have a free body, which can always be good, especially if you, say, maybe even need to tribute summon for one of your Hieratics to then use the special summoning abilities of the others to start getting the ball rolling. It's pretty cool. But anyways, for the spells, we see the 3 cards of consonants, obviously because there's 4 vanillas, not to mention you do have your Corseska, even your Debris if need be. So lots of way to just kind of cycle through your deck with that. The 3 copies of Dragon Shrine, 2 copies of Lance, 2 Hieratic Seal of Convocations, and the 2 copies of Reasoning. And then after that, the 3 Soul Charge, the staple of, the ruler decks usually, and 3 copies of Upstart for consistency, and the only traps being skill drains. Again, very standard, how the ruler decks kind of tend to be. Just, having their traps be skill drain, at least for the Hieratic Rulers. Sometimes the Mythic Ruler deck chooses to just, like, play, skill drain. Other times they'll play like wing blasts and stuff like that. But moving on to the side deck, we see the 3 copies of DD Crow, 3 copies of Electric Virus, I believe this card is called. You're able to discard this card and then take control of an opponent's machine or dragon monster, I want to say. Which is kind of cool given, there was some other ruler decks, and even then you have decks like Lightsworn Ruler that maybe even if they didn't top, they do play dragons. In terms of machines, obviously, there's Geargia, there's Cyber Dragons in the format, there's the gadget decks, like lots of ways to really just take advantage of this. And I feel like out of all the times I've kind of gone over these events, you haven't really seen this. So that's like very, very interesting. After that, the 1 extra copy of Tefnuit when going second, and the 3 copies of Maxi. Love to see it. After that, we see the 3rd copy of Lance, 3 MSTs, and interesting to see Compulse in the side for this deck exactly, but I would really be curious to hear why the Compulse was in the side for this. Maybe there was something specific that they were like afraid of. Like maybe in case there was something like a Evil Swarm deck and they would just wanted an extra way to deal with Ophion or something, but then you have like your skill drain. So I don't exactly know, but I guess, sometimes you just have an extra spot and you don't know what to throw in. So you just kind of throw something like that. Looking at the extra deck, we see 1 copy of Black Rose, 1 Michael, 1 Red Dragon Archfiend. This is, again, another card we just don't really see that often in the ruler decks in their extra deck. It has a pretty solid effect, usually just like blowing up all monsters that I think are in attack or defense. I forget which one. After it battles, it has one of those, but it also is a 3000 beater, so maybe even under skill drain that is very strong, or just sometimes maybe you just need an extra 8 to then I don't even know, maybe just another beater in a sense. After that, the 1 Scrap Dragon, 1 Star Eater, and 2 copies of Stardust. So choosing double Stardust over like 1 Stardust and 1 Stardust Spark. I guess if they're thinking there's going to be a lot of, things like artifacts, for example, this is a very good call, especially if you're trying to turbo through and get to skill drains, because this tributes for cost. For the Xyz, we see the 2 Gaia Dragon, 1 Gauntlet Launcher, 2 copies of King Atum, 1 Draco Sack, 1 Big Eye, and the 1 copy of Photon Strike Bouncer. Overall, really cool list, really cool to see the Electric Virus in the side. Congrats to this player, and on to the next list. So here we have the Mermail list, and just at quick glance, there's a couple things really standing out to me. Obviously being hand traps in the main and a split of hand traps at that, not to mention some of these side deck choices we don't see very often. So let's go through the card by card and talk about it. So here we have the 2 copies of Controller, very standard, 1 Dragoons, 1 Infantry, and 3 copies of Marksman. So the thing with the Atlanteans is we usually see a kind of a split of these in some shape, or form. Obviously, Dragoons is at 1, so they can only play 1, but then a lot of decks will choose to play like 2 infantry and 2 marksmen. Some will even go as far as like 2 infantry and 3 marksmen. The last list that actually topped was also playing 1 copy of infantry, but I believe they were only on 2 copies of marksmen. So seeing that they went a little heavier on the marksmen's to be able to pop those set cards is very strong. Also, you know, in theory, it has the ability that when it, I believe, inflicts damage, you summon one of your other sea serpents, I want to say, Atlantean monsters or something like that. I can't entirely remember off the top of my head right now, but the main use is usually just popping set cards. So if you're expecting a lot of the grindier decks, then having the triple marksman does come up more. After that, I'm going to skip over the hand traps for right now. We see the 3 copies of Undyne to pair, obviously, with our 2 controller, the 1 gun, 1 lead, 3 copies of Lind. The last list that topped was only playing 2, but here we do see 3. I would say 3 is more standard than 2 in general. The 1 copy of Megalo, obviously going with the 1 lead and 1 Megalo over double Megalo. 3 copies of Pike, 3 copies of Teus. This list is playing the Turge, which is very good to get back your resources from graveyard. The last list was not playing this, so it's nice to see that. The Mooling Glacia, and then the Title. So Mermail is one of those decks that sometimes you'll see like hand traps in the main, but usually it's just like 3 Max C or something, because usually the Max Cs are taking the places of cards like Upstart Goblin. And so here, obviously, we're not seeing Upstart Goblin, and we're seeing 2 Maxi and 2 Crow. I do really like the 2 and 2 split in a lot of decks. I think that in Mermail specifically, it's a little interesting because, again, you don't really see that. So I actually do like to see that a lot, and having the diversity of having Max C when you need it, or having Crow, which hits a lot more decks than Max C at times, is very nice to see. Looking at the spells, they played the 1 copy of Allure, 1 Dark Hole, and triple Soul Charge. As I mentioned, no upstarts, as obviously there needed space for some of the hand traps here. For the traps, we see a very clean slate of 3 Sphere, 2 Breakthrough Skill, and the 1 copy of Torrential. All of that honestly looks really nice. And looking at the side deck, they played 1 Cycle Reader and the 3rd copy of Crow and Max C. So they really wanted to hit some of those graveyard-based decks, at least post-side. So having the Cycle Reader as a double DV Crow for light monsters is nice, and the extra Crow, and then obviously Max C for those dragon decks or anything that special summons a lot. 1 copy of Mind Control, 3 copies of MST, and 1 copy of Twister. There's a lot of floodgates that can kind of hurt this deck, especially given, you know, cards like Macro are in the format at 1, and a lot of decks do choose to actually side that, as well as cards like, what is it called? Not Soul Drain. Is it Soul Drain? Maybe I'm forgetting what it is, or Mind Drain. It's one of the continuous traps. I'm kind of blanking right now. I don't know why. After that, we see 1 copy of Zombie World. Really nice to see that. We haven't seen this in a while, but obviously being able to change the types of monsters to zombies can be good, especially into, say, Spellbooks, which actually, now that I think about it, we didn't see any Spellbook in the top cut of this tournament, which is something very interesting given Spellbook usually takes at least 1 spot, it feels like, or at least gets very close to it, but I guess at the same time there wasn't that many Spellbook that entered. But in general, this can also hurt like Bujins that need, you know, their Beast Warrior status in order to actually get a lot of their effects. So really nice to see that. After that, we see 2 copies of Black Horn of Heaven and 2 copies of Light Mirror. Oops, did not mean to click that there. But yeah, we haven't seen any of the mirrors in quite some time in any of the side decks, Light Mirror or the Shadow Mirror, and I really like these cards. And so obviously Light Mirror hits the Lightsworn deck, it hits Bujins, it hits a lot of extra deck monsters as well. There's the Constellar artifact deck and stuff like that, or just artifacts in general. So really cool to see that, honestly. And then 1 copy of Malevolent Catastrophe and 1 copy of Warning. very unique side deck for the most part, at least in the tail end of this. Really like to see that. So looking at the extra deck, we see one copy of Black Rose, one Gungnir, and one copy of Leo, very standard. Usually Mermail has a pretty standard extra deck. One copy of Dweller, one Bahamut Shark, one Exciton, one Alucard, one Lavalval Chain, one copy of Levier, one Dracosac, one Mechquip Engineer, one copy of Gaios, one Abysstrite, one 101, and lastly, a copy of Big Eye. Overall, I'd say the extra deck is probably the most standard thing I saw out of this list. And then, yeah, the side deck was pretty nice. And the main deck was also pretty solid. The only thing that really kind of looked a little different is these hand traps in the main. But again, congrats to this player, and on to the next list. Here we have the H.A.T list. H.A.T is usually, one of the decks that plays a pretty basic in terms of their list. It usually doesn't have that much changes to, like, say, other lists, how sometimes there's a lot more variation in ratios and stuff. So I'm just going to kind of go through this quickly. This list sort of, in a way, I wanted to say it almost looks like Corey McDuffie's list, but I definitely see some big changes from it. And in general, I guess the one thing I'm noticing right away is they are choosing to main 3 copies of Max C, whereas H.A.T sometimes doesn't main any hand traps and they choose to play them all in the side. Or, like, for example, I believe Corey's list was playing like 2 Max C in the main or something like that. So that's what kind of made that stand out to me, as well as like MSTs, and I'm seeing that they're only playing the 3 artifacts here. But let's go through the card by card. Like I said, it should be a fairly standard list. 3 copies of Moralltach, 3 Firehand, 3 Icehand, 3 Max C, 2 copies of Dionea, and 3 Mermelio. For the spells, we see 1 Dark Hole, triple MST, triple Pot of Duality, and the 1 copy of Soul Charge. For the traps, we see 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 Bottomless, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, 1 Call the Haunted, that I would assume they cut down on. As I mentioned before, a lot of decks for any of the artifact decks usually play about 2 Call the Haunteds, so choosing just to play the 1, maybe it's because of the lack of, artifacts in the deck, or just in general, they were trying to make room for other things. Obviously, they have the Compulse here, and 3 copies of Fiendish Chain, that's also slightly different from a lot of H.A.T lists. They're kind of playing the Geargia lineup of traps, how usually they play 3 copies of Fiendish Chain and 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill. So a lot more decks have been starting to kind of develop that mentality of playing that sort of ratio for effect negations and stuff. But anyways, after that, we have Warning, Torrential, and here's again that 2 copies of Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. So interesting to see that popping up a bit more. Looking at their side deck, they played the 3 copies of DD Crow. Love to see it. Again, if you're maining the Max Cs, you should definitely have the Crows in the side. We see 1 copy of Mind Control, 2 copies of Nobleman, the 1 copy of Acid Trap Hole, and the 1 copy of Deep Dark Trap Hole, 2 copies of Blackhorn, 2 DNA Surgery, and 3 copies of Debunk. Overall, very clean side deck. Looking at the extra deck, it should be pretty standard again. The 1 copy of Dweller, 1 Durendal, 1 Karen Gorgon, 1 copy of Pleiades. This deck only really needs 1, given you're only playing the 3 artifacts again, and there's just certain situations where you'd rather go into a different rank 5 anyways. They are playing the 1 copy of M7 though, 1 copy of Emerald, 1 copy of Exciton, Cowboy, Gaia Dragon 101, Ragna Zero, Black Ship, the 1 copy of Volcasaurus, 1 copy of Rhapsody and Berserk, and lastly, the Tyrus. Overall, very clean list. Congrats to this player, and again, on to the next one. Next up, we have the Geargia Traptrix deck. And it's kind of a stretch to really call it like Geargia Traptrix, given it's only playing 2 copies of Mermelio, but usually that's kind of what the Geargia deck had played when it was playing the Traptrix engine. And right away, I feel like we haven't seen this build as much in H.A.T format. I forget if I said that kind of at the beginning. And right away, whenever I hear someone's playing the Traptrix variant of it, or at least, opting to choose the Mermelios over the hands, it kind of reminds me of the Vegas format builds of Geargia, because they would play the Mermelios and stuff. Obviously, Soul Charge wasn't in the format yet, and the hands weren't, but just looking at this list, it does kind of reminisce of how those lists look. So I'm kind of curious if there was any inspiration from that. Maybe they play Vegas or just something like that. But in general, I do like the lists that are kind of like this, and it's definitely different. We see tons of traps, lots of 3-ofs in here. And so, yeah, let's just go through the card by card. We see the 3 copies of Accelerator, 3 copies of MK2, 3 copies of Armor, 3 copies of Arsenal, 3 Maxi, 2 Mermelio, and one thing to note is they aren't playing the copy of Geargiano. So kind of interesting. This deck, being how it is a bit more grindy. And in a sense, Geargiano does lose a little more to, say, DD Crow, though only having 3 copies of the MK2 can kind of make your Geargia gears a little dead, because if you, say, draw into one of these, or 2 of these, I should say, then your Geargia gears are kind of dead unless you can get to like an Emerald or something like that. But in general, you're trying to kind of get through to your Geargia gear earlier on than anything, which we see with like triple upstart, which is sometimes builds of like this would play, like, for example, duality, because if they're trying to play a slower, grindier game with the traps, they can kind of give up 1 turn of special summoning to get deeper into their deck for stuff like that. So kind of interesting again to see that, but it's not completely unheard of, I would say. Looking at the spells, we see the 1 copy of Dark Hole, 3 copies of Soul Charge, and 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. So choosing not to play the Mind Control in the main either, that's another thing that a lot of Geargia lists will do. And even in general, 3 copies of Soul Charge without playing the hands or anything is also a little unique. Though even with the Mermelios and stuff, Soul Charge does give you extra monsters, plus when you special summon it, it gives you like MSTs in a sense, which some builds of Geargia play, some don't. Obviously this one isn't. They're focusing more on, say, the trap lineup, or even just, having some hand traps in the main. For the traps, we see 3 copies of Blackhorn, so they were really wanting to be able to just stop those inherent special summons, being able to stop even things I would assume like the Hieratic Tefnuit, or just Xyz in general. I know H.A.T is always a problem, and a handful of other things, 101s and stuff like that. The 1 copy of Bottomless, here we see the ratio of 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill and 3 copies of Fiendish Chain, as I mentioned prior, 3 copies of Geargia Gear, the 1 copy of Warning, and 3 copies of Traptrix Traphole Nightmare. To me personally, I feel that's a little excessive, but obviously it worked for them as they topped this event, and they just had a lot of hate for special summon monsters. Again, having like the 3 Blackhorns, the 2 Breakthrough Skills, 3 copies of Fiendish, and 3 copies of Traptrix Traphole Nightmare, they were ready for like a lot of stuff. So really, really cool main deck. Looking at the side deck, they played the 3 copies of Crow, 1 copy of Dimensional Fissure, there's the Mind Control in the side, and 3 copies of MST, 1 copy of Acid Traphole. That's a little different to see actually in the Geargia list, but I guess for the mirror and, other decks that can just set a lot of times, it is a very good card. 3 copies of Debunk, just an amazing card, 1 copy of Macro Cosmos, and 2 copies of Mind Crush. This is a card I feel we haven't seen as much in H.A.T format lately either, but it's a great card. Like, think even against like H.A.T or something, your opponent goes summons a Mermelio, searches a card, especially if, they have a lot of things that could hurt your hand specifically, you can just snipe it out. Or against Spellbook, sometimes just sniping out the extra Spellbook spell is really good after they search. Even if your opponent is playing a deck that plays Duality, there's so many times that this basically just becomes a free discard from the opponent's hand. So really nice to see that. Looking at the extra deck, we see 1 copy of Dweller, 1 copy of Emerald, Direwolf, Exciton, 3 copies of Gear Gigant, 1 copy of Alucard, 1 101, 1 Ragna Zero, 1 Giant Hand, 1 copy of Black Ship of Corn, 1 Rhapsody and Berserk, 1 Soulless Silver Mountain, and 1 copy of Zenmaines. Honestly, really, again, cool to see this list actually taking a spot in more modern hat format. And again, it really does remind me of a Vegas list. But anyways, on to the next list. So here we have the Mythic Ruler list. Again, they are playing the hands as I mentioned prior, which is really cool. Obviously, the hands are just great board breaker type cards, but also being fire and water, it does fuel your Dragon Rulers in Blaster and in Title. Obviously, both of these have very powerful effects that you can potentially even take advantage of in this deck. For example, being able to discard the Blaster and a Fire hand to pop a card, or having the Title with the Ice hand to be able to dump a card can be very good, especially if you see a Soul Charge or even like a Silver's Cry in a sense. Though at that point, I don't think it's really needed because I do see they are on 3 copies of Blue Eyes and 3 copies of Whitestone. I believe this player has topped or won another event with this deck in the past. I don't think they were on the hands at the time, but Mythic Ruler in general. So obviously, you know, they know what they're doing, and so let's go through the card by card. Here they are playing 3 copies of Blue Eyes, 1 copy of Flameveil Guard. Obviously, for the most part, whenever the Mythic Ruler decks are playing 3 copies of Blue Eyes, they are choosing to play just the 1 guard rather than like 2 and 2. They're playing the 4 Dragon Rulers, obviously, the Debris Dragon, the 2 Fire Hand, 2 Ice Hand, the 3 Whitestone, and that is it for the monsters. For the spells, we see 2 cards of Consonance, 3 copies of Dragon Shrine, 1 Foolish, 1 copy of Gold Sark, 2 copies of Silver's Cry, 3 copies of Soul Charge, and 3 copies of Trade-In, as well as 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. Obviously, this deck is known to kind of turbo through itself, so having the Trade-Ins and Upstarts and even like the Dragon Shrines to just kind of really cycle through your deck is nice. Next up for the traps, they are choosing to play 3 copies of Wing Blast and only 2 copies of Skill Drain and the 1 copy of Torrential. How I mentioned that a lot of decks for Mythic Ruler will play 3 Skill Drain, I do kind of like this call. And in the past, I have talked about decks that play Skill Drain, and sometimes if you see 1 Skill Drain, it's just enough. Because if your opponent can't out it for the turn or whatever, having multiples of this just kind of sit dead in your hand. So I think having multiple in, 2 is good. 3 can sometimes be too much. And so having the Wing Blast as just a card that it feels more useful at times, I do kind of like to see that in the main. Looking at the side deck, we see 3 Crow, 2 Flying Sea, and 2 Maxi. So very similar to, I believe it was that cat list in terms of hand traps in the side. And obviously, again, Crow is just a great card, Flying Sea is a great card, and Maxi does come up against some of those combo decks and stuff. Then they played 1 Dark Hole and 3 MST in the side. 3 MST plus 3 copies of the Trap Stun. So depending on the matchup, they had tons of back row removal. And then the 3rd copy of Skill Drain. Sometimes, Skill Drain does just win a match in itself. So having the 3rd just in case is nice to see. In terms of the extra deck, we see 1 Azure Eyes, 1 copy of Colossal Fighter, 1 copy of Crimson Blader, 1 Scrap Dragon, 1 copy of Star Eater, 1 Stardust, and 1 Stardust Spark. So here we do see the 1 and 1, unlike the Hieratic Ruler list. For the Xyz, we're seeing 1 copy of Felgrian, 1 copy of Exciton, 1 Heliopolis, 2 copies of Dracosac, 1 101, 1 Big Eye, and the 1 Giant Grinder. Honestly, a lot of this is pretty standard in terms of what you're used to seeing in a Mythic Ruler extra deck. But overall, again, really cool to see the hands build actually take a top spot. And with the 3 Wing Blasts, that's also really cool. So overall, congrats to this player, and only 1 more list to go. So let's go and take a look at that. Last up, we do have another cat list, and I already see some differences from the other cat list, my apologies. Here, for example, I see that they're not playing the Scythe, but at the same time, they are choosing to play the double Beagle Tack. So it seems like that was almost a trend for this event. on playing just extra copies of the Beagletach for when it does come up, as well as here we do see the 2 copies of Max C in the main, and that's it for the hand traps. So choosing to have the, Scythe Crows and the 3rd copy of Max C in the side is very, very interesting, as again, usually the cat builds that are playing the card do choose to play hand traps more so in the main, but obviously just wanting to see that engine. But anyways, for the card by card, it's very similar. 2 copies of Beagletach, 3 copies of Moralltach, 3 card D, 2 copies of Maxi, 2 Dianea, and 3 Mermail for the monsters. For the spells, we see the 3 Ignition and 2 copies of Double Cyclone, the Dark Hole, 3 copies of Duality, and 2 copies of Soul Charge. For the traps, 3 copies of Sanctum, 1 Bottomless, 2 copies of Breakthrough Skill, 3 copies of Call the Haunted, 1 Compulse, 1 Debunk in the main. I always talk about it. It's really cool when we see Debunk in the main, as it is just such a powerful card. 1 copy of Warning, 1 Torrential, and 1 Traptrix Trap Hole Nightmare. It honestly makes me think, I wonder if these players, were testing together or something like that they came up with such similar lists, which definitely could be a possibility. Looking at the side deck, obviously, as I mentioned, the 1 copy of Scythe in matchups where it matters, 3 copies of Crow, and the 1 extra copy of Max C, 2 copies of Nobleman across out. For the traps in the side, we see the 1 Acid Trap Hole, 1 Deep Dark Trap Hole, 1 copy of Blackhorn, 1 extra copy of Breakthrough Skill, so, choosing Breakthrough Skill over anything else. For their effect monster negation, the extra copy of Debunk, 2 copies of Wiretap, and interesting to see they are on the Transmigration Prophecy in the side deck. So obviously being able to shuffle up to 2 cards from the graveyards into the deck, it's kind of like the trap card version of DD Crow, as well as, you can also put back resources and stuff like that. So kind of cool to see that. We haven't seen that too often. I think usually Madolche does side this at times, but in general, nice to see. Looking at the extra deck, we see 1 copy of Dweller, 1 Durendal, 2 copies of the Pleiades, 1 M7, Exciton, Gaia Dragon, Double 101, the Giant Hand, which sometimes we see in the cat list, sometimes we don't, Black Ship Volcasaurus, the 1 copy of Rhapsody and Berserk, 1 copy of Heartland Draco, so choosing this over the Cowboy. Again, sometimes it just steals games, and it's kind of just a personal preference at times for people. And the 1 copy of Zenmayo, I like this. I personally, in my cat list, I do play Zenmayo. It's just a card that is really good, and it comes up a lot of the time. So really nice to see that. But overall, great list. Very, interesting to see some of these builds playing more so heavy into the artifacts here, in a sense, or at least which artifacts they're playing. Congrats to this player, and that is it. Overall, guys, you can let me know what you thought of this event in the comment section, and just in general, again, if you want to go and join in these hat format tournaments and play with these other players, definitely check out the video description to find out how you can go and join that Discord server. And if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it, comment any questions or videos you want to see in the future, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell to get notified anytime I put a new video out, share this video with your friends, and anyways, guys, I will see you in the next video.